I've been a freelance land surveyor for about 15 years. Most of my work is solo remote stuff. I'm usually camping out for days at a time in places nobody else is going to. I actually prefer it that way. Or at least I used to. Right. This happened about 4 years ago. I'd been hired to survey boundary markers on a parcel up in the mountains, near the Clearwater region in Idaho. Remote doesn't even begin to describe it. It was 6 miles of hiking just to reach where I set up camp. I filed my route with the local ranger station like I always do, and I packed a week's worth of supplies. The first day went smoother. I found 3 markers, logged everything, and made it back to camp before dark. The forecast had called for cold and light snow, and that's pretty much what I got. By the second day, though, things started to change. We got way more snow than expected. The next marker was only about a mile out of the way, so instead of calling it right then and there, I figured, what the hell? That was a mistake. I honestly still think about how stupid it was not to just hunker down or make it out of the woods when I had a chance. The terrain was all hidden, rocks and dicey slopes under fresh snow, so, to translate, the worst possible conditions to hike through. I was picking my way down a short embankment when my boot hit a patch of ice. I never saw it. One wrong step like that and you could die. And I mean that literally. I slid probably 15 feet before catching myself on a tree root. I was lucky not to have slid further, but the pain in my right ankle was instant. I tried to tell myself I was fine, but the moment I stood up, I audibly groaned in pain. I couldn't put much weight on that leg, and I knew it would be a few hours before I'd be able to walk normally. I was so mad at myself, but there was nothing I could do. I abandoned the rest of the work right there. No markers worth getting stranded over. I painfully made my way back uphill to the main trail and started the slow hike back toward camp. But after a few minutes, I noticed boot tracks on the trail which seemed to have come from further into the woods on my left. They were heading in the same direction I was going, and they looked somewhat fresh, which I could tell by how sharp the edges were despite the fact that it was snowing. I figured it was probably a hunter, or maybe someone from the landowner's crew, checking on the property. It's not unusual to cross paths with people out there, even in remote areas. I didn't think much of it. I just kept moving, trying to keep as much weight off my ankle as possible. As the light started fading, I began hearing sounds behind me. At first, I chalked it up to normal forest noises, but the more I listened, the more it sounded like footsteps. I kept turning around and looking over my shoulder, but I couldn't see anything. That part of the forest was pretty dense though, so if there were any animals stalking me or something there's a good chance that I wouldn't have been able to see it anyway. I stopped walking and the sound stopped too, not right away. But there was a delay of maybe 1 or 2 seconds, but they stopped. I froze up and tried to listen for anything out of the ordinary, but there was nothing beyond the wind and snow. I started walking again. And this time the footsteps didn't resonate, so I thought everything was good. Right. But then, a few minutes later, I heard those damn footsteps again. I kept turning around, but I couldn't see anything. It was especially freaky because I knew I wouldn't be able to run if there was a threat out there. That was the worst part. I would have loved to investigate or try to scare off whatever animal was stalking me, but I didn't have the mobility to do so. So I just kept moving. But then I heard something metallic off to my left. I don't really know how to describe it. It was this low sound, like something lightly hitting a fence post or a piece of equipment. It was freaky because there wasn't supposed to be anything but trees out there, so I had no idea what could be making a metallic sound of all things. The sounds must have distracted me, because it dawned on me that I hadn't been keeping track of those footprints I noticed earlier. I looked down and realized they were gone. I turned around frantically, but I couldn't see when they had branched off, or if they had turned around or something. I kept looking to my left, trying to see through the trees so I could at least spot whatever had made the sound. My eyes locked onto something, and the alarm bells started going off in my brain. There was another set of footprints coming out of the tree line on my left, running parallel to mine through the snow. They weren't that far away, which was the most concerning part. Whoever had been ahead of me on that trail was now walking alongside me through the trees. At that point, I was so scared that I wasn't thinking straight. I should have kept my mouth shut. I should have just kept going. But instead I spoke up, asking if anyone was there. I didn't get an answer, and after about 20 seconds of waiting, I knew I had to get out of there. But my stupid ankle was still killing me, so I couldn't move that fast. I wanted to run or at least jog, but I couldn't. I was pretty close to camp though, so I just told myself if I kept moving, I'd be fine. I wasn't hearing footsteps behind me anymore, which was good. But I knew there was someone out there, someone who had been ahead of me at one point, which didn't make sense. I was really close to my sight when I heard the sound of a heavy branch snapping from somewhere behind me. It obviously wasn't a natural sound, or I wouldn't bother mentioning it. I didn't stop moving. I kept thinking about how if I just made it back, I'd be good. And eventually, I did reach my campsite. It was fully dark at that point, and only after getting inside my tent did I realize I wasn't any safer in there than I had been hobbling through the woods. I started packing immediately. But my stupid foot made it so hard to move quickly. But I tried my best to rush. I'd say maybe 60% of how scared I was due to the fact that in a fight or a chase, I would be completely screwed without the ability to move properly. Before I finished packing, I heard the thing that I had been dreading the whole time, footsteps right outside the tent. I was so unbelievably scared at that point, and I started thinking about all the options. The footsteps weren't approaching my tent but rather circling it. There was nothing I could do but wait for them to charge my tent. The sounds of them circling went on for what felt like 5 minutes before everything went quiet. I hadn't heard whoever was out there walk away, but I didn't care. I was leaving. Person or not, I finished packing and took a really deep breath before unzipping my tent and stepping out into the snow. The moment I got outside, I looked into the trees and screamed. There was a guy standing in the tree line staring at me. He was really old and sickly, almost like he was dying. He looked disgusting. I stared back at him. I was fully expecting him to charge me, but he didn't. I put my hands up and said, "I don't want no trouble," and he didn't respond. I didn't know what to do. The staring contest lasted a few minutes before he said something I still think about. He said, "You're a lucky man," then turned and disappeared into the woods. The rest of that night is pretty blurry, partly because I was still in so much pain and partly because of the encounter. If that guy wanted to fight me or kill me, he probably could have. Right. With my ankle all messed up, there would have been nothing I could have done. I finished packing and left, not even caring about it being dark. When I eventually got checked out, I was told I had severely sprained my ankle and it was a miracle I hadn't messed it up worse by walking. I ended up reporting that freak in the woods, but I know nothing was going to come of it. I didn't take another winter contract for almost a year. I still do remote work. It's my livelihood and I'm good at it. But I don't camp alone on winter assignments anymore. I either bring someone with me or I turn the job down. This is still the scariest thing that has ever happened to me. I've lived in Alaska most of my life. My family moved to Fairbanks when I was 6, and I never really left. I spent my summers working fish camps as a teenager, started guiding professionally in my early 22nd, and that's basically been my life ever since. I'm 29 now. I work seasonally as a wilderness guide in northern Alaska, and I've been doing it long enough that I don't really get rattled much out there. I don't get lost, or I guess I should say, I didn't think I could get lost, because what happened 3 years ago kind of forced me to reconsider that. My boyfriend at the time was Randy. He grew up in rural British Columbia and was basically the male version of me when it came to the outdoors. Actually, that's not really fair to him because he was probably more experienced than me in certain areas, like winter navigation specifically. We'd been together about 4 years, and most of our relationship revolved around trips that would make normal couples absolutely miserable. We clung hunts and backcountry camping where you actually have to plan or you'll die. That sounds dramatic, but it's literally true up, hero up. The plan was to snowmobile between the state-registered cabins, about 60 miles apart. We'd spend a night at each and be back home in 4 days. We'd done the exact trip twice before, and it was always fine. The weather forecast looked good when we left, so we weren't worried at all. The first day was completely uneventful. We got to the second cabin by late afternoon, ate these freeze-dried meals that Randy swore tasted good but were honestly terrible, and then we played cards. It was a pretty relaxing evening. The next morning, I woke up and realized there was a genuine storm going on outside. It was basically a full-on blizzard that came out of nowhere, which was super surprising given the fact that there had been nothing indicating precipitation in the weather forecast. Randy and I decided to brave the storm despite the fact that we had plenty of food and could have totally waited another day. We should have waited another day. But I know that now. Things went south really quickly. The wind was almost worse than the snow. It was really hard to see much of anything, so Randy opted to take the lead. I was just following the path of his snowmobile, which was admittedly a lot easier than navigating the terrain in low visibility without anything in front of me, which is why I don't blame him for what happened. I don't really know how it happened, but 1 second Randy was just plodding along, and the next, his snowmobile was on top of him. I jumped off mine and ran over to him, but it was too late. His leg was bent in a way legs should not bend. Keep in mind, this was a guy who had once finished a two-day trek on a sprained ankle and didn't even mention it until we were back at the truck. The first thing I tried was getting him on my snowmobile. That was the obvious move. Just get him on the back and ride us both to the cabin. But Randy's 6'2" and probably 220 at the time, and those aren't like it's where you can just throw someone on the back and go. An Arctic cat in deep snow is already a lot of machine to handle by yourself. I got him up once, kind of half dragged him onto the seat behind me, and he lasted maybe 10 seconds before he slid off the side. The sound he made when he hit the ground is something I never want to hear again. I tried one more time and it was worse. He couldn't grip with his legs at all, and every time the machine shifted even slightly, he'd start to go, and there was nothing I could do to hold him and steer at the same time. After the second attempt, he told me to stop, and the way he said it, he wasn't asking. He was telling me. That's when we both kind of accepted what the actual plan was going to have to be. I pulled out the satellite phone, and my hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped it. I actually managed to get a connection after a few tries, but I wasn't sure if my message about our coordinates and where we were got through. Relying on someone else to come save Randy was a terrible idea, and we both knew it. I knew what had to happen. I'd leave him sheltered with everything we had, then take my snowmobile and push for the nearest cabin to use the emergency radio. There wasn't really a discussion about it. Randy just looked at me and I looked at him, and that was it. I got him set up with every extra layer. We hadn't marked our coordinates on my GPS. He told me to be careful, and then he told me not to do anything stupid. And then I just left him there in the snow. I was navigating mostly by feeling GPS, but the circumstances seemed so dire that I was having trouble not freaking out. After about 45 minutes, things started feeling off, like landmarks weren't matching up and the terrain didn't look right. I kept telling myself it was the snow messing with my perception, but the feeling just got worse and worse, and then I saw smoke through the trees to my left. I angled toward it, thinking I somehow looped back to one of the cabins, but the structure didn't match either one. It was smaller and kind of ugly, honestly, with one side almost buried in a snow drift. There was a faint glow from inside, and the smoke was coming from the chimney. I just realized smoke meant a person, and a person meant a radio, or at least a way to warm up enough to keep going off. I killed the engine and trudged through the snow over to the door. I knocked a few times expecting someone to come over and open the door, but no one did, so I tried the door handle and realized it was unlocked. I walked in and was kind of surprised to discover that it was really warm in there. It was definitely inhabited. There was a wood stove in the corner with a fire going, and a bedroll on the floor. There was also a can of some kind of food on the floor with a spoon still in it. It honestly looked like whoever was living in there had walked out the door 5 minutes before I came in. I announced my presence, but no one answered. So I just stood there, warming my hands and trying the satellite phone again, but I had no luck, which was pretty disheartening. Still though, I didn't want to go back into those treacherous conditions yet. But I had to. Randy's life was depending on it. As I was turning to leave, I noticed something sitting on the shelf on the back wall. I walked over to it and realized it was a pair of binoculars along with a folded map and a notebook. I unfolded the map and realized it was a trail map of the area we'd been riding through. Sections of it were circled in marker, and I recognized some of them. 2 of them specifically. Both of the cabins we'd been staying at were circled, and there were dates written next to them in pencil, some from that winter, some from the winter before that, and so on. I picked up the notebook and realized whoever it belonged to had been documenting people. There were descriptions of people, like what they were wearing, what direction they were headed, that sort of thing. I was instantly really unsettled. There was a good chance Randy and I were somewhere in that notebook, but I wasn't sticking around to check. I don't really know how to tell you what it felt like. It wasn't fear right away. It was more like every single thing in the cabin just sort of rearranged itself in my head. It didn't feel like a safe place anymore. I put everything down and went straight to the door. Bike. Before I could reach the door handle, I heard the loudest and scariest scream I've ever heard. It came from below me, under the floor. It was a woman, and they weren't saying anything, just screaming at the top of their lungs like they were getting stabbed. The shock made me literally jump, and I just ran for the door. I started my snowmobile as fast as I could and rode out of there without even looking back. I never got another glimpse of the cabin. I was a total mess after that, to the point where I don't really remember the rest of the journey. At some point, I made it to the real cabin and got through on the emergency radio. They had to dispatch a helicopter just to make it to Randy, and he was near death, hypothermic for one, and his leg was in terrible shape, but he was alive and conscious. It was the worst few hours of my life, to the point where I have trouble even piecing together the sequence of events. Randy survived, but the experience was so traumatic that he swore off winter navigation forever, or at least as long as we were still together. I told as many people as I could about that cabin and that scream, and I was told they'd send someone out there as soon as the conditions were safe to do so, and you best believe I followed up on that. After a few days, they eventually told me they'd sent a small team out there, but they weren't able to find a structure matching my description and location. The guy I was speaking with actually had the audacity to suggest that I hallucinated the whole thing, and I flipped out on him. That was basically the end of the conversation. Randy and I broke up about a year after the incident, and it had nothing to do with any of this. But I still think about this all the time. There are really only 3 ways to explain what happened that day, and none of them are good. The first is that none of it was real, that I really did hallucinate everything from the cabin right down to the scream. I was terrified and half frozen, and I just left my boyfriend to potentially die in the snow, and my brain constructed a detailed 10-minute experience inside a building that didn't exist. I can't fully rule that out. The second is that it was real, and that person screaming was someone who needed help, someone who I just left there, probably to die. The troopers either couldn't find the place or didn't try hard enough. And whoever was under those floorboards, I don't even know what could have happened to them. The only other explanation is that it was some kind of trap. Maybe the smoke and the light were supposed to draw someone in, and whoever wrote those notebook entries had been tracking people through the area for a while looking to kidnap someone or God knows what else. And I had walked directly into it. Or worse, maybe that trap had actually worked. Maybe that was someone unlucky enough to walk into that cabin sometime before me. And if I had gotten there a little earlier, it would have been me under those floorboards. I'm not sure what to make of any of this. When I was a junior in high school, there was this girl I spent a lot of time thinking about. Her name was Sienna Rollins. She had this alluring presence about her that's kind of hard to explain, but I'll try my best. She was really pretty, of course, but it was more than that. She had this mystique that I could never decipher. A mystique that you wouldn't typically associate with a generic pretty girl. She wasn't popular, and I got the impression that a lot of guys, girls too, were more intimidated by her than anything else. She wasn't warm and she didn't smile, and most people regarded her as weird. I didn't. I actually found her uniqueness kind of fascinating. Catching eyes with her would freeze me up, kind of like the way your body adjusts to a cold room or an unexpected gust of wind. She reminded me of snow, honestly, the way that a light snowfall can muffle everything around you, including your own thoughts. She had that quality, but it was like no one noticed but me. People just thought the way she kept to herself and never spoke was weird, but I was always dying to know what she was thinking. I read a lot of young adult fantasy novels around that time, so that probably had something to do with it. I wrote a lot around that time too. I actually named one of the characters in the story. I was writing Sienna. You could say I was obsessed, but I also just liked that name anyway. I was walking up the stairs with my friend George one day, talking about that exact story, when he asked me what the characters' names were. So I told him, and of course, as soon as I mentioned the name Sienna, who turns the corner but the actual Sienna, walking with one of her friends. She flashed me a smirk, the closest thing to a smile you could get out of her, and she said, "Yeah, because you love me," or something along those lines. I was so embarrassed, and George started laughing, which made it even worse. She was already moving past me, clearly not interested in continuing the conversation, and my window was closing. I don't know what came over me, but right there on the spot, I asked her out. That actually got her to stop, and she gave me one of her famous icy stares. She didn't even have to speak. Her eyes communicated everything. How dare you even ask me that night? But then she surprised me. She actually agreed and gave me her number. Then she said she'd text me and walked away, not even letting me respond. I was shocked, but that's how I ended up going on a hike with the girl I was obsessing over for months. The hike wasn't my idea, by the way. None of it was it. She organized it all, and I got the impression that I had no choice but to go along with whatever she wanted, and I was fine with that. So fast forward to the weekend, and Sienna's driving us out to this trail she picked. I'd never been to it, and neither had anyone I knew. The drive was about 45 minutes, but it felt like 10 because I was so in my head. Sienna had her window down and was playing music from her phone. Stuff I didn't recognize, weird tracks. We pulled into this gravel lot at the base of the trail. There were maybe 2 other cars there. Sienna didn't even think twice. She just started walking and I followed. For the first 20 minutes or so, things were actually great. Sienna was more talkative than I'd ever seen her, which admittedly still wasn't that talkative, but for her, it was a lot. She asked me about the story I was writing, which was kind of embarrassing, but I gave her a rough summary while not trying to sound like an idiot. The trail narrowed after a while and the trees got denser. We hadn't seen another person since the parking lot. At some point, the trail split into a fork. I asked Sienna which way, and she pointed left without hesitating. I asked her if she'd been here before and she said, no. I found that a little strange, especially considering how definitive she seemed to be about everything, but I didn't say anything. The left fork was noticeably less maintained. I started to get the feeling we were going the wrong way, but I wasn't going to question her. I must have been really in my head about that, because at one point I realized I couldn't hear Sienna's footsteps behind me anymore. The trail had gotten so narrow that we were walking single file, and I had taken the lead since she had gestured me to go first. But when I turned around to check on her, she wasn't there. The trail behind me was empty. I yelled her name, but I didn't get a response. I was confused, so I started walking back the way we had come. I made it back to the fork and she wasn't there either. I figured she had probably stopped to use the bathroom and didn't want me to notice, which was a reasonable enough explanation. But I looked around some more and realized there was no side trail for her to wander off on. She was just gone. So I decided to try the right fork. To my surprise, that side was even more overgrown, and the further I walked, the less it felt like a real trail. I kept calling her name like an idiot, but I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't imagine why she would have abandoned me, so I genuinely thought it was an honest mistake or something. At one point, I heard a branch snap somewhere off to my left, deeper in the trees. And then, when I looked over, I saw movement. Something shifted behind one of the thicker trees. I instantly knew what was going on. It was Sienna messing with me. That would have been on brand for her. So I figured I'd turn the tables on her and surprise her before she could surprise me. I slowly walked over to the tree as quietly as I could, and at the last second, I jumped to the side to scare her. But as I was mid-yell, I realized it wasn't Sienna. It was a man. I was horrified, but it was too late. I was inches away from this tall, middle-aged looking man who didn't seem scared in the slightest. I instinctively took a few steps backward and the guy just stared at me. Before he could say anything, I blurted out that I was just looking for my friend or something like that, which in hindsight was a completely useless thing to say. He clearly didn't care. He started walking towards me, so I turned and started walking back toward the trail, trying not to run. But then I heard a second sound, this time from my right. I looked over and saw another person moving through the woods. The second guy wasn't even trying to hide. He was just standing in the open watching me, and he was holding what looked like a tree branch in his hand. That's what I just ran. The second guy was blocking the path back to the trail, so I was just running through the woods with no real sense of direction, hoping there was another way back to the main trail. As soon as I started running, both men started running after me. They weren't even trying to be quiet about it anymore. I ran for a few seconds, but it was hard because the woods were so dense. Before I could react, something grabbed my ankle and I fell. It was the first guy, and he was trying to pin me down. I screamed and kicked, and by some miracle, I was able to get him off me. I scrambled back to my feet and kept running. My mouth was full of blood at that point. I don't think they followed me after that, but I didn't care. I ran until I found the trail, then kept running until I made it back to the parking lot. Sienna's car was still in the lot, but the other two cars were gone. Sienna wasn't anywhere in sight, which freaked me out. I started thinking those guys who had tried to catch me got her and that she was in danger. I didn't know what to do. I must have called her phone like 10 times, if she didn't pick up. I was just about to call the police when she texted me, asking where I had gone. I was typing a response when I looked up and saw her walking out of the tree line, completely calm. I yelled at her to hurry, trying to explain what happened, but she didn't seem fazed. I told her I wasn't kidding, but she seemed more irritated than anything. Either way, we got in the car and started leaving. I told her everything, and she still didn't seem particularly moved, which was absolutely insane to me. That's when I demanded to know where she had gone. She told me she thought I had gone ahead without her and that she was trying to catch up the whole time. I knew that was a lie because I walked all the way back to the fork, so there's no way I would have missed her. That's when it dawned on me that she might have had something to do with it. What that something could have been, I had no idea. The ride back was the 10th Street 45 minutes of my life. I kept looking over at her and wondering whether someone so innocent and nonchalant could do something so heartless and cruel. Honestly, the answer was probably yes. She got to my house, we said goodbye, and then I was alone again. I was still so shocked by the whole encounter. I couldn't get over the fact that within minutes of Sienna disappearing, two strangers appeared in the exact stretch of woods she led me into. The trail she picked, the fork she chose, and the position she put me in by letting me go first. It felt orchestrated. And then she just showed up after the whole thing without a scratch on her, asking me where I went. I didn't hang out a single time after that. I never asked her to, and if I wasn't reaching out to her, there was absolutely no chance she was going to reach out to me. I told maybe 4 or 5 friends this story over the years, and the response is always the same. Sienna set me up. That she knew the trail and knew the people in the woods. I've considered that more times than I can count, but I just have no idea why anyone would do that. I have no idea where Sienna is now. She's not on social media, and I have no idea where she went to college. On April 21st, 2016, a Reddit user made a thread in the Black Ops subreddit asking why would there be 30-ish Wi-Fi networks seemingly emanating from under a concrete pad. The user went on to state that he had recently lived on a semi-urban farm property for a few months in Hawaii. He had noticed a few unusual things that he didn't decide to reveal, however. One thing that stood out the most was the fact that there were about 25 to 30 low-strength Wi-Fi networks somewhere in the neighborhood. In hindsight, it may seem normal to have a number of networks that are available, but what made the situation weird was that it was all exactly the same strength, peaking at the same point location, and it seemed to be originating from underneath a concrete pad which was made to simply cover gravel and dirt. The user then had the idea to utilize a Wi-Fi analyzer just to be sure that it wasn't some sort of coincidence where maybe numerous neighborhood networks somehow happened to have similar signal strength based on the distances they were from their sources. He also stated that he walked in circles while operating the Wi-Fi analyzer, and as he walked further from the point location on the concrete pad, the weaker the signal became. If that wasn't weird enough, another peculiar fact was that these network SIDs would change every 5 minutes or so. In an effort to further uncover the mystery, he used a thermal imaging device to detect any hotspots on the ground. He then decided to drill directly on top of a spot that was notably hotter compared to other areas on the concrete pad, along with a number of other holes as a form of control. This was then followed by filling them with water. To his surprise, only the hole that was directly on top of the hotspot drained the water, and the others overflowed. Later on that same day, he was asked by other editors if there were any indications of a power source nearby. He answered by reporting that there were power lines. However, they were disconnected from the city's main grid and that there was a very wealthy neighbor who owns a steel frame building where the power cables go. He also states that the whole mountain area was being used by the military during World War II. This being the case, there are no reported military bases in the mentioned position according to the military bases .com website, though the user had mentioned that he had no doubt there are underground facilities there. While in the same comment thread, he asked to other Reddito RS for their opinion on the heat signatures. One of them replied by asking for photos of the surrounding area. The user then provided photos that sparked even more suspicion. These included a multi-breaker setup where the lower conduit runs under asphalt and toward the peak signal point location with the corresponding hotspot, the hole that fills up with water, and a bucket found on the property which he said reminded him of the hydroxide body disposal scene from the TV show Breaking Bad. The user was also asked if there was any way to measure the thickness of the concrete pad, because if the heat was coming from below, you would expect it to dissipate, not stay as focused as it seemed. In response, the user posted a photo showing that the concrete pad was about 2 times the thickness of the surrounding area. He also stated that it was extremely hard and seemed to have river rocks mixed in, whereas the surrounding area didn't and was easy to drill through with a hammered Rilland masonry bit. As the user tried his best to drill into the pad, he managed to get to approximately 2 feet away from the hotspot location. According to him, the heat was unbearable there. He compared it to the inside of a composting bin, but there were no signs of microbial activity. He also noted that the soil was red volcanic dirt, which shouldn't have any biological activity anyway. Unfortunately, this is where the comment chain ends. However, there were other developments to this mysterious story. The user was then met with another question. He was asked if he could connect to any of the access points or gain control of the devices so he could identify manufacturer. He was also asked whether the power meter was moving significantly, which would indicate it was powering multiple devices, and if there were any heat vents nearby. He replied that it was possible. However, he couldn't crack the passwords. He didn't mention anything about the power meter, but he did send a picture of the general area where he suspected the heat vents could be hiding. In the same thread, it was also noted that the building seen in the picture had been partially built by questionable contractors. It was also mentioned that large liquid tanks had been removed from the ground there, meaning there had to be a lot of underground space available. At the same time, a nearby municipal storm drain was recently removed and a newer, significantly bigger one was built directly opposite the property line, which he believed could serve as an entrance to an underground area of some sort. Additionally, there were two important factors the user shared. Firstly, he said that on multiple occasions, he saw a truck making late-night trips to move a lot of busted up, new-looking concrete from the trash bins of the neighbors. Secondly, and arguably the most important detail, he connected his old boss's account to an eBay seller going by the name of Cheesy Bay, which had extremely suspicious reviews and feedback. In a twist of events, the feedback and reviews were then set to private, which implied that the owner found out about his discovery. When asked about this, the user stated that he was in a, quote, pretty good spot and that they wouldn't get him easily. So this is where the threads ends, but the mystery continues on. The mentioned eBay account was known to sell strange items, such as faulty hard drives and other faulty electronics. Other than people looking to restore broken devices, who would actually think to buy faulty hard drives. This story takes an even crazier dive, because that eBay account is where everything got linked to Pizzagate, a conspiracy theory that went viral during the 2016 United States presidential election cycle. The theory claimed that the New York City Police Department had discovered a pedophilia ring linked to members of the Democratic Party while searching through Anthony Weiner's emails. In the end, there is no real ending to this mystery. It was later reported that the original user allegedly had mental issues. This is supported by the fact that the user's old boss had actually commented and provided details about him, including the fact that he ripped off his ceiling fan because he believed he was being watched. He also claimed that there were no real connections as to why the user would suddenly intrude and link his boss's account to the eBay seller. Of course, the boss could be lying, because nearly everything discussed in the story had some form of evidence attached to it. Nevertheless, this mystery will remain unsolved. On Tuesday, December 16th, 2025, a Reddit or posted in the home maintenance subreddit something that was eye-catching enough for moderators to delete it within the hour. The post was recovered by a viewer and sent to me on December 23rd. The post states, "I have cut myself pretty badly in my rented apartment. Fortunately, everything is all right, but I don't really want to notify the owners of damage on the walls. What would I need to make this disappear?" You don't have to look at the picture for long to realize this is a very oddly shaped and placed blood splatter. The original poster was very vague about how exactly he cut himself. It would have had to have been a pretty graphic accidental slice of a knife to lead to a blood splatter like that. On the wall, there is a noticeable chip in the wall right in the center of the thickest part of the blood splatter, which would imply the blood wasn't sprayed on the wall, but rather the blood on the wall was the result of something hitting the wall. What makes this post more unsettling and suspicious is that the user is known to post in the alcoholism subreddit, stating he gets drunk on average 5 days a week. But according to one of his other posts that was made just a month before this one, his girlfriend had cheated on him and left him due to his drinking, and she left him right before the ring he ordered had arrived. The viewer who sent this to me reported this in the RBI subreddit, which stands for Reddit Bureau of Investigation, which led to the poster blocking him, even though he never directly contacted him. So, I'm sure I don't have to explain where I'm going with this. But whether this could have been a deleted post that was in reality a man secretly trying to cover up something horrible that happened in his apartment, involving his cheating ex-girlfriend, or simply just a very unfortunate coincidence, for now remains a mystery. It's not uncommon to hear cases about squatters living illegally in other people's houses without their knowledge. This is the story of a Reddit user named Random Girl to you, and it happened in 2016. She was coexisting with an individual who she actually knew but would never have expected to be the intruder. Understandably, she didn't share a lot of information, but enough was said to show just how creepy her situation was. The whole ordeal was posted in the form of updates over time, meaning she was actively finding evidence in the form of random objects around her house, particularly in the attic. Now, up to this point, it may seem like any other story about a typical squatter living illegally in someone else's home. I've even covered stories about squatters in people's attics before, but what transpired while he was there is more terrifying than any of those other stories I've covered. The user started her story by mentioning that she lived in a fairly large house. In her bedroom, there was a door that led outside to a small porch. She went about her day like she normally would, sweeping the ebony-stained wood floors, something she did often because the material showed even the smallest speck of dirt or dust. She continued her usual routine when suddenly she stumbled upon a tooth sitting right in front of the door on the bedroom floor. Judging by her almost OCD nature, it seemed like the tooth had just recently appeared. She said it had not been there at any moment earlier in the day. She was so shocked that she stood frozen, trying to recall if she had accidentally hit her head and forgotten about it, or if she had been experiencing a tooth etch and didn't notice one falling out. Still confused, she stood there running her tongue along her teeth to confirm it wasn't hers. After discussing the situation with other users online, the topic of a squatter living in her home surfaced. As reluctant as anyone would be, she finally accepted the possibility, especially because she had already noticed a number of odd things happening in her house, such as missing items, random objects being out of place, and other strange instances that might normally seem trivial but still raised an eyebrow. Living alone has its ups and downs, but in a situation like this, it's never a good idea to investigate a potentially hostile individual in your own living space. But being that as it may, the user replied that it would take too long to wait on anyone, so she went to investigate alone. What she found was only the beginning of a nightmare. It started with finding a smudge in the opening of the attic. Still worried about her safety, she decided to take it slow. She sat and waited to see if there would be any signs of life. She lost track of time sitting in silence, listening for any sound or movement, but all she got was the pure silence that had been accompanying her the entire time. The following days were filled with updates about her findings, and the more she looked, the creepier it got. Because she wasn't very tall, she could only peek slightly past the attic opening. Luck was on her side. A quick scan of the attic layout showed that there were objects laid about but no visible sign of a person. Still disturbed by the thought that she might not be living alone, she decided to get a taller ladder and a better flashlight. That kind of bravery motivated other users to keep purging her to get to the bottom of the mystery, and it makes sense. She worked in enforcement for Game and Fish Commission, and she was trained. But even she admitted she was a smallish woman living in the middle of nowhere. In the next update, the user confirmed that someone had been living in her attic, matching both her suspicions and the suspicion of other users. But the intruder was not present at the time. Some of the items she found were 8 beer koozies, some of her own personal belongings, a pile of change, and a $20 bill. At first glance, those items might seem harmless, but it gets worse from there. As time went on, law enforcement eventually got involved to help locate the squatter and remove him from the property. Usual procedures were carried out, such as objects being dusted, prints being taken, and items being located. She began to calm down as she realized she wasn't alone in this anymore. In due time, she was told that someone had been visiting her attic for a very, very long time. After hearing that, she made it a point to start locking her doors and even installed new locks just to take an extra step for safety. Unlike most squatter stories, this one was especially unique because the intruder only visited the attic when the user was home. The case was later considered a stalker case based on the behavior and items found. Some might ask, why weren't her doors locked in the first place? Well, her response to this exact thing was she didn't lock her doors unless she was sleeping. She lived in a small community of about 400 people, so it was a very slow, quiet lifestyle there. She also said she wasn't worried about robbers because if someone really wanted to break in, a locked door wouldn't stop them. But what she couldn't understand was the tooth. It didn't make sense because it wasn't even on the path that led to the attic. And if it wasn't for one top comment, she would never have thought to check the attic in the first place. The user knew the sheriff well, which is expected in such a small community, and that made things even worse because she started to feel like it could be someone who knew her personally. A quick update later revealed that she was receiving unsolicited explicit photos while all this was happening. It was never confirmed who sent them. The user eventually went through the safe where evidence was kept, and what she found was pretty disgusting and horrifying. There were the giant pickle jars that the intruder had been using to collect his semen. Among other things, there were thousands of tissues, maroon socks, toilets, and more items of the same nature scattered around. On top of that, there were also the user's clothes that had been missing for over a year, including underwear. That alone puts into perspective how long the creep had been doing this, moving in undetected and carrying out his acts while she was completely oblivious. There were also strange items like a plastic butterfly, a bobblehead wooden turtle, more beer koozies, and black and pink straps with Velcro on the ends. Very weird, questionable things to possess in someone's attic. Sometime later, the user received a call that was supposed to put her mind at ease. That should have answered all questions, that the perpetrator was caught and the nightmare was over. But instead, the identity of the intruder would haunt her for the rest of her life. It turned out to be the 70-year-old neighbor, married to the same woman for countless years, who happened to be a church deacon, father of 4, and grandfather of 6. This final story comes from a Reddit post in the famous subreddit called Let's Not Meet, and the original poster's account has since been deleted for a good. Right. From what we can gather, the story suggests the poster was an adolescent male from North Wales, UK, a place known for its beauty and natural landscapes. However, being in the countryside, there isn't much to do, and as teenagers, curiosity is a dangerous fuel. Teens will always want to explore. But when the daily routine mostly involves herding animals, harvesting crops, picking fruit, and similar activities, it's only a matter of time before a teenager snaps. So, out of boredom, the user and a few friends often found themselves wandering the countryside and coastline. Despite the area being sparsely populated, there was a road with 2 separate carriageways running right along the coast from Wales to England. There were also train tracks that ran alongside it for most of the way, occasionally passing overhead via a small cement bridge. One night a few years ago, the user and 3 friends decided to explore one of the bridges where the train passed overhead. When they reached it, they noticed a manhole cover nearby. Upon closer inspection, they believed it lead to some kind of access room. Intrigued, they tried to pry it open, but without tools they couldn't, so they returned the following night prepared. Unbolting the cover wasn't easy. They had to work quietly because the train tracks were right next to them. Not close enough to endanger them, but close enough that the train conductors could spot them on Dre's alarms, which would likely mean the police. Surprisingly, it didn't take long. They lifted the heavy steel disc and wasted no time climbing down the ladder, not knowing where it led or what could be waiting below. Once they reached the bottom, they moved deeper into the structure. At this point, they were completely confined in a narrow passage leading into the main area. They were perplexed by what they found. They had always assumed it was just a bridge, and if they hadn't found the manhole, they never would have guessed there was an interior space at all. The group endured a tortuous journey, squeezing and crouching through whatever space they could find. They scraped their stomachs against the walls as claustrophobia slowly crept up on them. The distance from end to end was far longer than expected, but at the halfway point, they were able to look through narrow gaps in the ground and see the road below them, which strangely gave them a sense of comfort. At that moment, it was still just an adventure. It was uncomfortable and cramped, but it was manageable. But that was about to change. Just before passing the halfway mark, one of his friends claimed he could see something in the distance at the far end. Hesitant but curious, they all agreed to check it out. That turned out to be a terrible decision. The user was the first to reach the end of the walkway. He stated that the dread he felt in the moment was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. There was a single foldable chair facing a wall, and on that wall was a partially torn page from a newspaper or magazine showing a fully nude woman in erotic pose. But he even said he couldn't refer to it as a normal erotic picture, because the woman's eyes had been removed from the page, as if someone took a knife to them. Below the picture on the wall, there was a bloody condom on the floor. And when they saw this, the boys left as fast as humanly possible, desperate not to run into whoever was responsible for what they had just stumbled into, which almost seemed like a crime scene to them. When they reached the ladder, every one of them silently prayed the manhole hadn't been resealed. They wouldn't know until they reached the top, but luckily it was still open. The reason the user mentioned the population earlier was because what they had witnessed was completely out of the norm. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and where anything weird going on would be hard to fly under the radar for long. In the end, being a naive teenage boy, the user never told a single soul what they found, but he admitted later that it would have been wiser to report it, because it was clearly not the behavior of a healthy-minded person. The story ends there, but the user did post updates about returning to the location multiple times, hoping to have something to update with that. Eventually he stopped, because the investigation wasn't going anywhere and it was better to stay alive than to risk his own life. I was living alone in a small rental house just outside town when this happened. It was a one-story place at the end of a short, dead-end road. There were only 5 houses on the street, and at night, it was usually quiet. I worked from home doing freelance graphic design, so most days I didn't leave unless I had to get groceries. I didn't get visitors often. My friends usually texted before coming over. That's why the first knock stood out. It was around 8:45 at night on a Thursday. I was in the living room watching TV when I heard firm knocks on the front door. I muted the TV and waited, thinking maybe I imagined it. Then, there were 2 more knocks. I got up and walked to the door. There's a small peephole in the center of it. When I looked through, I saw a man standing on my porch holding a medium-sized cardboard box. He was wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap. He looked normal, maybe mid-30 seconds. I opened the door but kept the chain on. He immediately said that he had a delivery that required a signature. He read a name off a small handheld device. It wasn't my name. It wasn't even close. I told him he had the wrong address. He looked down at the box, then at the device, then back at me. He read the address out loud. It was my exact address. I told him no one by that name lived here. He stared at me for a second, longer than necessary. Then he said he must have been given the wrong information and would take it back to the truck. I watched him walk back down my driveway. I expected to see a delivery van, or at least a car parked somewhere nearby, but there was nothing. He walked past my mailbox and turned the corner at the end of the street. I didn't see where he went. I shut the door and locked it. I told myself it was just a small company delivery, or maybe a contractor driver without a marked vehicle. The next night, at almost the exact same time, there were 3 knocks again. This time I didn't open the door right away. I went to the peephole first. It was the same man with the same jacket and box. I didn't open the door. I just spoke through it and told him he already came by and that no one with that name lived here. He didn't answer right away. Then he said he just needed a signature and that the system showed the package had to be delivered tonight. I told him I wasn't signing for someone I didn't know. There was a long pause. Then he said okay and stepped back from the door. I stayed at the peephole instead of walking away right away. He stood at the edge of the porch looking at the house. He slowly turned his head toward my front windows, then toward the side of the house, then back at the door. After about 15 seconds, he finally walked down the driveway again. I saw no vehicle. That's when it started to feel wrong. On the 3rd night, There was no knock. I actually felt relieved. I thought maybe he figured out the mistake. I even joked to myself about how weird it would have been if he showed up again. On the fourth night, I was in the kitchen washing dishes around 9 p.m. when I heard four knocks. It wasn't on the front door. It was on the side of the house, near the dining room window. I slowly walked into the dining room and looked toward the window, but no one was there. But then, there were four more knocks at the front door. I went to the peephole and it was him again, but this time he wasn't holding a box. His hands were empty. I didn't say anything and he knocked again. Then he stepped back and looked directly at the peephole. I stepped away from the door so he couldn't see movement, and I didn't make a sound. After about 30 seconds, he turned and walked away. I waited 5 full minutes before checking the windows. I walked around the house with the lights off and looked through the blinds. I saw him standing across the street near the tree line. He was just standing there facing my house. After maybe a minute, he walked off into the darkness. I locked every window and door again, even though they were already locked. The next day, I called the local police non-emergency line and explained what had been happening. The officer I spoke to said it sounded like someone trying to verify occupancy. He said sometimes burglars will knock to see if someone answers before trying to break in later. He told me to install cameras if I couldn't to call 911 if the man came back. That night, I left all the lights off in the front of the house and stayed in my bedroom. Right. 45. Right on time. There were four knocks. I didn't respond at all. After a few seconds, for more, then silence. I waited about a minute. Then I heard something else, a soft thud against the back of my house, and then another. I realized it sounded like someone testing the back door. I grabbed my phone and quietly walked into the hallway. I could hear the back door knob turning slowly, and then stopping, and then turning again. I called 911 like I was instructed and whispered that someone was trying to get into my house. While I was on the phone, the knocking started again at the front door. The dispatcher told me officers were on the way. The back door knob kept turning. There was more than one person. Then I heard the sound of something metal scraping lightly against the door frame. After about 30 seconds, everything stopped. Even as it was totally silent though, I stayed on the phone until the police arrived. When they searched the outside of the house, they found fresh pry marks on the back door near the handle. The officer told me if I hadn't been home, the door likely would have been forced open. They drove around but didn't find anyone suspicious. The next night, I stayed at my brother's apartment across town. I didn't tell anyone on social media or anything that I wasn't home. I just left. Around 9 p.m., my phone rang. It was my neighbor from the houses down. She said there was someone standing on my porch knocking repeatedly. She said he had been there for at least 5 minutes. She asked if I was home. I told her no and asked if he had a vehicle. She said she didn't see one. I told her to call the police. Officers arrived and questioned him. Later that night, an officer called me and said the man claimed he was trying to deliver a package, but he misplaced it. He had no company and no marked vehicle. They warned him to stay away from the property. 2 days later, police arrested him in a nearby neighborhood after he was caught attempting to break into a house where the owner was out of town. In his car, they found multiple empty cardboard boxes and a small handheld scanner that wasn't connected to any real delivery company. During questioning, he admitted he would knock with a fake package first. If someone answered, he would leave and mark the house as occupied. If no one answered after multiple attempts, he would come back later and for entry. He told detectives that sometimes he would knock several nights in a row to see if the pattern changed. If lights were on one night and off the next, he assumed the house was empty. Hearing that made me realize how close I was to not being home that first week. If I had ignored the door on one of those early nights, he probably would have come back later expecting no one inside. I moved out of that house 3 months later when my lease ended. I still don't answer the door at night unless I know exactly who's coming over. If someone knocks unexpectedly, I stay quiet and check cameras first. And if anyone ever shows up with a package that has my address but not my name, I don't even go near the door anymore. This story starts in the lead up to Christmas. To set the scene, I live near Glasgow in Scotland. I stay with my parents, siblings, cats, and dogs. We're a close-knit family and often spend nights together in the living room watching TV, playing games, and catching up on our lives. At the time of the story, I was 16 turning 17. I was in high school but getting closer to leaving and starting my education outside of it. In the days leading up to Christmas, during one of those late nights together, we were watching A Christmas Carol. We often have movie nights around Christmas, and it's one of my favorite things about that time of year. During the movie, we heard a knock at the door. This wasn't unusual, so we didn't think much of it. My mom got up to answer it, but nobody was there. The street was empty. Our garden wraps from the front of the house around to the back, so she checked along the side of the house too. But there was nobody there either. She came back inside and we resumed the movie. A few days later, I was sitting at the living room table doing exam work when I heard another knock. I paused my work and went to answer the door, but again, nobody was there. We assumed it was probably neighborhood kids playing a prank. Where I'm from, kids sometimes get bored and cause trouble instead of finding something better to do. In Scotland, there's a game called Chappie, where kids knock on someone's door and run away laughing. It's stupid, but as a kid, the adrenaline rush of someone opening the door to nobody there can be weirdly fun. We have a family group chat where we keep each other updated on things, and throughout that week, several family members mentioned experiencing the same thing. The one that stood out the most was something my dad experienced. At the time, my dad usually stayed up later than everyone else, either playing Xbox or watching shows once the house was quiet. One night around 11:30, when the street was silent and all the kids would have been inside, he heard a very quiet knock. He was confused because of the time. He checked through the peephole before opening the door, but he saw nobody. He slowly unlocked and opened the door to look outside again. Nobody was there, just a quiet, empty street. He locked the door and came upstairs to ask if anyone had heard it, but because the knock was so quiet, nobody else had. This started to unsettle us because it had been happening repeatedly. Nobody had ever seen or heard anyone outside except for the knocking itself. Usually, when kids do this, you hear them laughing or running away. This felt different. Christmas Day is when everything escalated. We spent the day with family opening presents, sharing gifts, watching movies, playing games, and eating way too much food. It was a great day. Later that night, I felt sick from eating so much, which I always do at Christmas, so I went upstairs to lie down. I ended up dozing off and woke up hours later. When I checked my phone, it said to Dwight, dear old Em. Everyone else was in bed and the house was completely silent. I knew I wouldn't be able to fall back asleep because once I wake up, it's hard for me to sleep again, no matter what time it is. I stayed on my phone in the dark, scrolling social media instead of turning the TV on, watching Christmas present haul videos and messaging friends who were still awake. It's normal during Christmas break when there's no school or responsibilities, and you try to enjoy the freedom before going back to exams and routines. After a while, I heard a faint knock. I wasn't sure if it came from my door or my window, or if I imagined it. I sat up straight in bed, staring into the dark room with my heart racing. I didn't want to move. I knew nobody should be outside at that time on Christmas night. I didn't know if the past few weeks were just getting into my head, or if someone was actually inside the house. My room is on the second floor, so someone being at my window would be very unlikely. After what felt like forever, I finally worked up the courage to open my bedroom door. As I did, I heard what sounded like footsteps coming up the stairs. My brain immediately assumed it was my dad coming up to bed, after staying up late like he usually did. I stepped into view of the staircase to tell him I was still awake and heard the knocking again. Night. That's when I realized it wasn't my dad. It was a man I'd never seen before that night. I immediately felt sick when I saw him. I wondered if this was the person behind all the knocking. He was already inside the house. He was staggering as he climbed the stairs and looked heavily intoxicated. I slowly backed into my room, luckily without him seeing me, and I quietly shut my door. I could hear him walking around and opening doors, going into each room one by one. I remember thinking it was only a matter of time before he reached mine. I completely froze and didn't know what to do. It felt like all my common sense disappeared. Eventually, I opened my door slightly and saw him coming out of my younger sister's room. That's when my brain finally kicked back into action. I ran to my parents' room and woke them up, telling them there was a man inside the house. My mom woke up instantly, while my dad was still groggy. We went downstairs together and found the man passed out on the couch with my dad's beers opened and scattered around him. My mom shouted at him to get out. He woke slightly and angrily insisted the house belonged to him. We tried to get him up, but he was completely dead weight. My mom slapped him trying to wake him, but he barely reacted. A few minutes later, my dad came fully downstairs, saw what was happening, and immediately took control of the situation. He shouted at the man that this was not his house and threatened him to leave. The man refused. My dad eventually had to physically lift him off the couch and drag him out the side door. He forced him outside and warned him not to come back before shutting the door. We thought it was finally over, but seconds later, glass suddenly shattered toward us. The man had punched through the window, sending broken glass inside. He pushed his face inside the broken glass, like something out of The Shining. While my dad went to call the police, the man started shouting aggressive threats, saying he now owned the house, that he knew what we looked like, and that he would return. Needless to say, we were all in shock. It was hard to believe someone would do something like this on Christmas night. Eventually, he left and the police arrived. They took statements from all of us. Mine was the longest, since I had seen him first. Not long after the police left, luckily because it was the winter. It had snowed that night, which is actually rare where we live since we usually just get slush. There was a clear trail of blood leading down the street. Police followed it to a nearby playground where they found the man lying on the ground with blood and glass in his hands. They arrested him after and later confirmed they believed he was the intruder. Our window was replaced the next morning. We told my siblings what had happened. Surprisingly, they slept through the whole thing, probably knocked out from all the Christmas food. Later, I got a restraining order against the man because of my age and the threats he made. He was fined for the damage and given community service instead of jail time. When police questioned him about the weeks of knocking at our door before the incident, he claimed he knew nothing about that and denied ever doing it. It turned out he actually lived at our house years before we moved in. He claimed there was no bad intention and said he had simply drank too much while out with friends and accidentally went into the wrong house. Thankfully, nobody in our family was seriously hurt. The only injury was my mom bruising her wrist from slapping him while wearing bracelets. Apparently, that hurts you more than the person you hit. To this day, we still have no explanation for the knocking that happened before that night. Even now, sometimes I feel like I hear a knock late at night. Maybe it's just in my head, or maybe it isn't. I guess I'll never know if it was him or someone else out there watching. This happened around 2010 when I was about 6 years old. My family and I were living in a small neighborhood in Springfield, Oregon. It was my older brother, sister, my mom, and I, as my dad was deployed at the time. I was really close with my dad and always took it hard when he was away. Late one night, I sat on the porch with my mom while she smoked a cigarette and we watched the rain. While we were sitting there, cold but enjoying the rain and each other's company, we noticed a man walking in the middle of the road. He was wearing one of those oversized yellow rain jackets. It immediately caught both of our attention because it was pouring rain really late and there was no one else usually out at that hour. We sat there watching him as he began walking slightly toward our driveway. Wait, my mom stood up, grabbed my hand, put her cigarette out, and we watched as the man stopped walking right next to our garbage cans in our driveway. My mom turned to take us inside, and the man began yelling at us. I don't remember what he said, but I remember being so terrified as my mom rushed me inside. As soon as we got inside, my mom locked the door and turned off all the lights. But at that point, I was terrified, and of course being a kid, I started crying. My mom rushed my siblings and I, choosing us, and we all went and laid in my parents' king-size bed together as we were all a bit worried. But nothing else happened. There was no more yelling or noise or anything, so we all drifted to sleep. That night, I had a terrible nightmare I can still picture to this day. It was of a man in a big yellow range jacket peering through our window. I woke up terrified and crying, literally shaking my sister awake, just so I could tell her I was scared. I have no idea how much time passed. My sister got out of bed and walked me to the bathroom that was attached to the bedroom. She shut the door and spoke with me while I cried, trying not to wake my mom or brother. But while we were in there, we suddenly heard banging, loud banging, on the front door. My sister burst out of the bathroom and started shaking my mom awake without saying anything. And naturally, my brother woke up from the sound too. I sat terrified in the bathroom while my mom motioned for my siblings to join me in there. We watched her walk out of the room toward the front door. My siblings and I were all crying, scared out of our minds as this man was still repeatedly banging on the door. My mom must have been trying to find her old BlackBerry phone but seemingly failed, because when she came back, she didn't have it. That meant none of us could call the police, since this was the only phone in the house. We sat there in silence listening to the man who was now screaming and yelling for us to let him in while still banging loudly on the door. It was honestly a really hopeless and fearful night. It was just the five of us with no phone to call the police, and my dad, who is normally our protector, was gone. We sat there on the floor huddled together, freaking out and praying our neighbors would call the police, but nothing happened. Eventually, the man left, but no police ever came. What was strange is that it was a small neighborhood where everyone lived close together, and our house specifically was a duplex. So how not a single neighbor heard this and called the police is beyond me. Eventually, we went to sleep and everything was okay for a while. But not even a few weeks later, still just the five of us at my home, my family woke up to my front door wide open, along with a window open and a huge hole cut into the window screen. My mom immediately called the police. There were lots of random items missing, including my piggy bank filled with all my holiday savings, along with random items around the house. But the most disturbing thing missing was a giant vase filled with cash and coins that my family had been saving for months. The sickening part was that it had been on my nightstand, right next to my bed where we were all sleeping. This was a long time ago and sadly, my mom has since passed and my dad wasn't there when it happened, so I'm not really sure what other details I might have missed. I do know that the intruder was never caught. I also don't know if the same man who was harassing us that night was the same person who broke into our house weeks later. It could be connected or it could not be. I do know that none of us were harmed, which makes me feel like maybe it wasn't the same person, because that man seemed really aggressive for someone who just wanted money. But on the other hand, I later found what looked like the same giant vase sitting on the porch of a neighbor, who was a man that lived alone and that we never really saw. So honestly, who knows? This happened to me almost 3 years ago, almost to the day, while I was in Idaho serving a full-time mission. The town that me and my companion, who I'll refer to as Spencer, were assigned to was quite small, so there wasn't always a lot for us to do. And on top of this at the time, I was going through a rough patch, things like self-esteem issues and having trouble sleeping. So as a result, we found it difficult to stay up all day doing work. One other thing about where we were assigned was that we were living in an actual house, albeit a tiny one. Usually we only ever get apartments, but I guess for this area, a house was the only option. Probably because there were no apartments anywhere nearby. The layout of the house was fairly simple. As you walked through the front door, you entered the main room where our desks were, and immediately to your right was our bedroom. If you kept walking straight, you would walk through a large open doorway that led right into the kitchen. From there, to your right was the bathroom and to your left was the laundry room. And that was it, besides one storage closet in the kitchen as well. One other detail was that although the house technically stood on its own lot, the landlord's house was right next door, and any time we had problems with something, we could just walk over or call him. On this particular night, I was sitting in the living room at my desk on my phone, with my chair turned to face the kitchen, and Spencer was sitting in the bedroom on his phone. It had gotten dark outside a couple of hours earlier, so we returned home and were just relaxing before we went to bed. In the middle of whatever I was doing, I heard a single knock come from the window above the sink. And because of the layout of the house where this window was, you could basically see the whole living area where I was sitting. I looked up at the window for a few seconds but only saw darkness. I went back to what I was doing and began to think that it must have just been a branch or something. There were large trees behind the house, but the more I thought about it, the more unlikely it seemed. None of the trees were close enough to the house to brush the window that way, and it wouldn't have made a knock sound like the one I heard. In the middle of having this thought, I heard another knock around the corner at the window in the laundry room. The full weight of what was happening was finally coming into focus, but my mind was still looking for an explanation that didn't conclude that someone was outside circling the house stalking my companion and I. I started to tell Spencer what I had heard from the living room, but as I was, another knock came from the window in the living room, the one right next to me. I didn't see who it was on the other side, and I didn't want to. I jumped up and ran into the bedroom and locked the door. I asked Spencer if he heard it too, and he said yes. We started debating what to do. All we had for weapons were a couple of knives, and we didn't know how many people were actually out there or if they were armed, so going to confront them on our own was out of the question. During our discussion, the knocking sound moved from the window in the living room to the front door itself, and we were getting more and more freaked out. We briefly debated calling the police, but we were in the middle of nowhere and it would take them forever to get out there to help us. Right. Then Spencer remembered we had the landlord's number. He called him and began explaining the situation. And by this point, we hadn't heard a knock at the door for a couple of minutes or so, but I knew what that meant and I was dreading it. When it finally came, a knock at our bedroom window. The blinds were closed, so we couldn't see who it was and they couldn't see us, but that didn't make me feel much better. Spencer told him someone was stalking the house, and he said he would be right out with a shotgun. We waited for another few minutes, anticipating another knock, but nothing happened until finally our landlord came to the door and announced himself. We asked him if he had seen anyone, and he said no, but that he saw a pickup truck speeding away as he approached the house. I asked if he had gotten a license plate or any other features that could help the police, but he said they had already been too far away for him to see anything. Spencer and I grabbed our flashlights and circled the house with him. There were small patches of snow on the ground from a weather system that had come through a few days earlier, and in the snow, we saw footprints indeed circling the house, and as far as we could tell, there was only one set. We debated calling the police, but we knew that there wouldn't be much help in tracking the guy down. The landlord said to call him again if the guy came back, and with that, we went back into the house, locked everything down and tried to sleep. But we couldn't. The first thing that came to mind was other missionaries playing a prank on us. But if that was the case, then why didn't they reveal themselves or say gotcha or something like that at some point? Also, it was past curfew. Everyone was supposed to be home, and the closest missionaries to us were at least 20 minutes away. The other possibility was that it was some teenagers from the ward playing a prank, but that didn't seem likely either, especially afterwards, because again, they would have come back and started laughing at us. And there was only one set of footprints we found. If it was a prank, I feel like that would have been a group thing to do. After the facts, no one ever fessed up when we did some asking around. So to this day, we still have no idea who was outside or why they chose to harass us. But the scariest thing to me wasn't the knocking, or how the only thing separating us from him was a thin layer of glass, but the fact that I likely looked right at this guy when he first knocked on the window in the kitchen and didn't even know it. From that day forward, my sleep only got worse. Nothing worked, and my own personal issues did not improve either. I'm not sure I'll ever go back to that house.